I'm joined now by economist and author Dambisa Moyo. Last year she published her first book, Dead Aid. The book is about how Africa can escape the cycle of extreme poverty, disease and corruption. The solution is, according to Dambisa, to stop giving aid to Africa. That's right. The only way that the rest of the world can help Africa is to give it less money, or to give it less money. We'll find out which is the correct pronunciation there. But Dambisa's here right now. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
The front of your book says, why aid is not working and how there is another way for Africa. And on the back here it says, the last sentence here, first we must destroy the myth that aid works and make charity history. Explain.
Well, the main thesis of the book is really about Africa becoming an equal partner in the global world. There are no countries on earth, there's not a single country on earth that has achieved long-term growth and meaningfully put a dent in poverty by relying on aid to the extent that African countries do today. And we know this as policymakers and as economists, as development people. We know that aid cannot deliver economic growth and reduce poverty. And yet, we continue to push that strategy on the African continent.
But I mean, you say, yes, to make charity history. But I mean, if someone's watching this now and was thinking of making a donation to some food charity or whatever in Africa, should they say, right, we won't send that £1,000 because it'll spoil the Africans, and I should just spend it here?
Well, I think we as a global society need to be much more humble and less arrogant about what exactly charity can do. I myself am involved in a number of charities. I understand that it might act as a band-aid solution, but it's not going to make Africa grow at 10% a year, create jobs and reduce poverty. And I think that's the message of the core message of the book, that we need to start doing things that actually can meaningfully transform the African economies.
But if people are going to die of hunger and starvation and things like that if they take your advice here and make charity history. Well, you're going to need charity until your plans work, and that could take a lot longer than 5 years or 10 years.
Well, let's just take a step back. In 1970, for example, about 10% of the African population was living on less than $1 a day. Between 1970 and now, we've spent a lot of money, billions, close to $1 trillion of aid has gone to Africa in one form or another, either in the form of charity or in the form of governments giving out charitable donations to African countries. However, today, over 70% of Africans live on less than $1 a day. So by your metric and what you're suggesting, if we continue to push a strategy of charity to Africa, I'm arguing that in 10, 15, 20 years from now, we won't have 70% of Africans living on $1 a day. We'll have 90%, maybe the whole continent living on less than $1 a day. We know what works to create jobs, which is what Africa needs. And we know what it is that actually can create growth in these economies, but we're not doing that. We're pushing a strategy that has no evidence anywhere of actually creating.
But who's pushing the strategy? Because people who receive money, come back to charity in a minute, but I mean, people who receive, countries who receive large grants in overseas aid or whatever, I mean, it's their decision what to spend it on. Why don't they want to spend it on what you're recommending? Of course, in the long run, it would be perfect if all the countries of Africa were economically sound, growth figures rocketing and all of that. But that takes a long time in the rest of the world, and it's going to take a long time there.
Well, first of all, I don't think it necessarily takes a long time. I mean, in our lifetime, China has moved over 300 million people out of poverty. And India has done a similar feat. And we have, even in Africa, countries like South Africa and Botswana that have actually meaningfully put a dent in poverty. It's no surprise that these countries have not relied on aid. They have actually created jobs because they know that that is what the key to success is. So I actually don't think it takes a long time. I think it takes political will. I also believe that we have enough evidence, as I've said already, to show that aid doesn't work. It creates corruption, it creates dependency, it does not create jobs, and it creates a system that actually encourages African leaders to focus on courting and catering to the donors and not listening to what African citizens have to say. And that is a fundamental problem. We're so obsessed with Africa being a charitable case that we're not having the right discussion about
So
alternatives.
you don't think that what Bob Geldof has done for Africa is good? You think it's bad? You think it's not the solution, it's the problem?
I think that Africa, we know it has fewer, on an absolute number basis, it has fewer poor people than China or India. And yet, we don't feel sorry for China, we don't feel sorry for India. We feel sorry for Africa. And I think what we've got, the problem has been that the PR around Africa. It's incredibly negative. I do fear that the celebrities have basically pushed a negative picture of Africa. They tend to focus on war, disease, or corruption and poverty, when there are a lot of positive things that are happening in Africa that would allow Africa to attract investment and transform the continent. And that's where I do quibble with the celebrities. And besides that, I think that we need to hear more from African leaders. It is them who are charged with the responsibility of increasing growth in Africa. We rarely hear from them on what the strategy is. I, as a voting person in Africa, I want to know what African governments are thinking. I'm not interested in hearing about what the celebrities or the charities feel needs to be done in Africa, because otherwise it really erodes the core relationship between me and my government.
Well, the other thing, of course, about it is that there are all these... I don't see why Bob Geldof should be rejected for that, because the reason he talks about hunger is that there is hunger, and the reason that there is death in various forms, including internecine warfare within countries, the reason they mention that is because it is there.
Absolutely, but you know what? There is
solve it without admitting
there's more poverty in China than there is in Africa. You know, we rarely see a Chinese advertisement asking for handouts from the British population on television, because the Chinese government has very astutely figured out that a negative messaging around China is not going to attract the investment that these countries need. So if the celebrities use their platform in a positive way to show that Africa's got a vibrant young population, I'd be more sympathetic. But really portraying African children as impoverished, as we often see, is not helpful, I don't see.
But it's true.
It's true, but it's only partially true. That's part of the story, and it's the story that is not helping. If I went and took pictures of inner city of America, that is not the whole picture. And it's very, very detrimental to the long-term economics of the countries.
Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you for having me.
As you can see, there's plenty to read and bite on in this book. It's called Dead Aid by Dambisa Moyo. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A remarkable film showing a very different side of Pakistan.